In 1920, an infant sat on a mattress while a white rat moved within reach of his hand. The baby did not recoil. He leaned toward it. He touched it. The rat was strange, but it was not frightening. Then, as the child reached again, an adult behind him struck a steel bar with a hammer. The noise was sudden and terrifying. The baby cried. The rat returned. The noise returned. And eventually, the child began to pull away from the white rat before the metal bar was even struck. This is the experiment where a baby was taught to fear a white rat. The infant is remembered as little Albert. In the published paper, he is called Albert B. The researchers were John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner, and their article, Conditioned Emotional Reactions, was published in 1920. Before we go deeper, subscribe to the experiment files. This case is short on paper, but every detail changes how the room feels. At that moment, psychology was changing. Watson was a leader of behaviorism, the idea that psychology should study observable behavior rather than rely on private feelings people could not directly measure. He wanted to know whether an emotional reaction such as fear could be created through conditioning. That sounds abstract until you remember the subject was a baby. Watson and Rayner first tested how Albert responded to different things placed near him. A white rat, a rabbit, a dog, cotton wool, masks, burning newspaper. Albert generally approached these objects without the fear the researchers wanted to study. There were things that frightened him naturally. A sudden loud sound was one of them. That baseline matters. Without it, an observer could simply say the baby had always disliked the rat. The early observations gave the researchers the comparison they wanted. Before the pairing, Albert reached toward the animal. After the pairing, the sight of it could make him withdraw. It also tells us something about the confidence of the researchers. They were not guessing from a single dramatic moment. They built a before and after record. First, they presented objects and watched for calm approach. Then they introduced a stimulus already known to startle him. Then they asked whether one could contaminate the other. That is why the white rat became the center of the story. It was not dangerous. It was useful precisely because Albert could begin with curiosity. If you are tracking how fear is learned, you need to see the moment when a neutral thing stops being neutral. So the researchers paired the harmless animal with the frightening noise. As Albert reached for the white rat, a steel bar was struck behind him. The child startled and cried. Later, the pairing happened again. The rat did not change. The meaning of the rat changed. That sentence is the hinge of the whole experiment. If this kind of story helps you understand psychology as lived experience, like the video so more viewers find the file instead of only the myth. After the pairings, Albert reacted differently when the white rat appeared. He pulled back. He cried. He tried to move away. The researchers reported that a fear response had been conditioned where one had not been obvious before. Then they tested whether that fear might spread. Albert was shown other furry or white objects. A rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, even a Santa Claus mask with white hair. His reactions were not identical in every moment, but Watson and Rayner interpreted the observations as evidence that the learned emotional response could generalize beyond the original rat. This is where the experiment becomes larger than one animal. Generalization is the frightening part because learned fear does not always stay neatly attached to the original trigger. A child who has never been bitten by a rabbit can still react to the rabbit if the rabbit resembles the thing that was paired with terror. Watson and Rayner were interested in that spread. They were asking whether emotional life could be shaped by association, not just by instinct. In a laboratory sentence, that is a research question. In the room, it means placing a baby before object after object and watching whether the fear follows. In the paper, the language can feel clinical. Trials, responses, stimulation, transfer. Clinical language can help record events carefully. It can also create distance from what the reader is seeing. Every line about a response represents a child being placed back in front of something the adults now expected would upset him. That is the fact that makes the story lodge in the mind. They were not only asking whether a child could fear one object. They were exploring whether fear, once installed, might attach itself to anything that looked close enough. An adult can understand an experiment. An adult can ask to stop. Albert could not read the plan. understand the purpose, or give consent to a procedure that deliberately made him afraid. The paper speaks in the language of observation and response. But behind that language is a small child whose distress was used as data. Subscribe to the experiment files if you want the next case handled with the same rule. The result matters, but the person inside the result matters more. By modern standards, the ethical problems are obvious. Researchers do not get to induce fear in an infant simply because the result would be interesting. The fact that little Albert remains famous is not an endorsement of the method. It is partly a warning about what science can call acceptable when the subject has the least power in the room. There is also a mystery people often add to this story. What happened to Albert after the experiment? Researchers and historians have proposed identities for the child and different accounts of his later life. Those claims have been disputed. The responsible truth is narrower. The original paper documents Albert B. during the conditioning work. His later identity and fate are not settled enough to turn into a clean ending. That missing ending matters. Watson and Rayner discussed removing the fear, but Albert left the hospital environment before a documented process of undoing the conditioning could be completed. The experiment is remembered for creating the response, not for clearly repairing it. That is not a small footnote. If a study claims value from producing fear, the repair should not be treated as optional housekeeping. The unresolved removal is one reason the case still feels unfinished. We can describe the conditioning step with confidence. We cannot close the story by saying the fear was cleanly undone. Think about the order of events. First, the baby reaches for something harmless. Then adults create terror at the exact moment he reaches. Then the baby begins protecting himself from the harmless thing. From the outside, it looks as if the rat causes fear. Only the people who designed the room know where the fear came from. That is why learned fear can feel so real. Once the reaction is inside you, the object in front of you seems to explain it. You may never see the noise that was paired with it in the first place. Little Albert became a landmark in psychology because it offered a dramatic example of conditioned emotion. But it also became something else. A portrait of research power used on someone too young to refuse. The story does not need an invented tragic ending. The documented beginning is enough. A child reached for a white rat without fear. Adults deliberately changed that, and when he recoiled, they wrote down what they had made happen. The experiment is sometimes introduced as if its only lesson were that fear can be conditioned. But there is a second lesson in its endurance. A dramatic result can become famous even when the person who paid for that result never had any power to agree to it. Modern ethics did not make the data less interesting. Modern ethics force science to admit that interest alone is not enough. If you had been in that room, would the question have been worth the cost? Tell me in the comments whether the most disturbing part is the fear itself, the generalization, or the missing repair. Subscribe to the experiment files for another true experiment where the result reveals as much about the researchers as it does about the subject.